MIDI remote integration in Cubase 12 uses MIDI remote scripts to easily map parameters on your MIDI controller to custom parameters for your workflow in Cubase. To do this, open up your lower zone, and then make sure you're on the MIDI remote page. Now, if you have a newer model MIDI controller and Steinberg already has a MIDI remote script made for it, the device will just simply show up here and you're ready to roll. To check if your device has a script, click on Open MIDI Remote Manager, and then select Scripts. If you see your device in this list, it means that there is a pre-made script already for your device, and you can just select it here. However, for me, I'm using a Novation Launch Key Mark II 61-key MIDI controller. And you can see the only script here is for the Mark III version. So I'm going to have to create my own script for this, but fortunately enough, this is very easy to do. So I'll go ahead and just close this out, and then I'll click Add MIDI Controller Surface. Now you'll see all of my connected MIDI controllers here, including my launch pad, monogram, and my launch key. So I'm going to select Launch Key MIDI, and then for the output, I'm going to select Launch Key MIDI as well. And for the model, I'll just type in Launch Key 61. I'll click Next. And here you can quickly map any of your knobs, faders, or buttons. And on my MIDI controller, I'm just going to turn each of the knobs to learn all 8 of my rotary knobs. So now all 8 of my knobs are mapped. I can go over to faders and I can start mapping my faders. So I'll do the same thing. I'll just move each fader to learn every single one of them. And there's actually 9 faders. There's 8 channel faders and 1 master fader. Now, as you're mapping controls, you can actually adjust the size of the grid here, the size of the device, and you can also grab your individual knobs and faders and you can move them around to reposition them to be more like the configuration of your MIDI controller. So for my MIDI controller, I want to select all of the faders here. You can do that by holding Shift, and I'm going to move all of these over to the left, and then I'm going to move all of the knobs over to the right. And then additionally, you can extend the range of the faders. So they're kind of short right now, but if you grab here, you can lengthen each fader. So now I'm going to start mapping buttons. So I'll place my first control here, and I'm going to press all of the switch buttons below each fader on my MIDI controller. Additionally, I can map each of my beat pad style buttons. So I'll start here in the same position below each of the knobs. I'll map the first 8. So the top row is all mapped. Then I'll go down to the bottom row and I'll press each of the bottom row pads. And lastly, I'll map each of my transport controls. To save space, I'm going to sort of condense the grid here, and I'm going to put the transport controls, I'll put them here instead. So these controls are rewind, forward, stop, play, loop, and record. Okay, so I'm just going to make the grid a little smaller here. And now that I have all of my controls mapped, I need to assign functions to each of these controls. To do this, you open the Mapping Assistant. You'll see each of your controls here, and you can select them. Then click here, and this opens the Functions browser, where you can search for different commands. For example, I want to map each of the faders to mixer bank zone channel volumes. So you can see under here, Mix Console, Mixer Bank Zone, Channels, and then I'm going to map the volume for each of these 8 channels. So what you do is you click on a particular controller, then go select the parameter that you want to map it to, and then click Apply Mapping. So now my first fader is assigned to channel 1 volume. Then I'll go over to channel 2, learn channel 2 volume, channel 3 volume, and so forth and so on until all 8 of these channels have been mapped. Now the cool thing about this is when you use the Mixer Bank Zone option, the faders will bank, so you're able to control more than just the first 8 channels. You can actually control all of the channels if you like. Now, if I close this out and I go into the Mix Console here, and I scroll all the way over to the left, and then I'll select the very first channel here, Main Drums, you'll see that all 8 of these channels have this little white indicator under it. This is showing the Mix Console bank selection. So as I move each of the faders on my MIDI controller, you'll see this controls each of these 8 channels in this bank. I took a moment off screen and mapped the rest of my controls to various functions that I normally use for playback and mixing. So in addition to volume faders, I can move to the next bank, I can move to the previous bank, and I can shift the bank left or right by 1 channel at a time. The knobs I've assigned to pans for each bank channel. The beat pad buttons are assigned to mutes on the top row and solos on the bottom row. Then for transport controls, I have rewind and forward. Press these to start moving and then press them again to stop. I have basic start and stop functionality. The loop button activates cycle mode, and the record button records. Now, this may seem like a lot of work to do up front, but the best part about this is that Cubase will save this script so that you can easily recall it later, and you can even make multiple different scripts for the same MIDI controller. Maybe you want one for mixing, another one for editing, and another one for adjusting instrument controls. So there's a lot of deep functionality built into this new MIDI remote integration.